Okay.
So we're going to talk about my mother, Dione Neutra,
Hmm.
who I knew in the last 50 years of her life. She lived to nearly 90 years old, and so she was 38 when I was born, and as I was knowing her, she was in her 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s.
Hmm.
And one of the characteristics of our relationship was that as a young kid, she told me lots of stories about her childhood.
Hmm.
Um, she had a mother, my maternal grandmother, from a North German Catholic family, and a father from a free-thinking Swiss family, um, with a lot of ties to Germany and high German culture. So, uh, but the stories that she told me were memories of things. For example, I remember um, as a little girl, yeah, that she liked to tell this story about how, as a little girl, some friends of the family came by and her parents were away.
Hmm.
And she, being a generous kind of child, picked a bunch of flowers from the garden and gave it to these people. And the people were walking home with this armful of flowers and said, "Oh, we were visiting your house and your little girl gave us all these flowers." And um, my grandmother came back again and said, um, "Oh, how did the Schmidts get all these wonderful flowers?" And my mother thought that maybe she'd done the wrong thing, and I think tried to pretend that she didn't know. And then her mother said it was okay and that you were a good little girl to be so nice to our friends. Or she would tell the story of how at Christmas time in Switzerland, the the Christ child was the one who brought the presents, not Santa Claus. And that one day when they came back from school, the window to their room was open and the snow was blowing in and all their toys were gone. And um, she was told that that was the Christ child had come and taken their toys because they had gotten all chipped and hadn't been taken good care of. And so they were feeling very crestfallen about that. And then on Christmas Eve, there was a room that was closed up that something special was going to happen in. And there was a bright light that went around the house when the Christ child was there, and the bright light happened in the room, and they opened the door, and there was a Christmas tree with candles burning on it, and underneath the Christmas tree were all their toys, which had been freshly painted and refurbished, and it was a big excitement. Or she told the story about the hatching of rhinoceros eggs, which was a game that they played in their upstairs bedroom where the four little girls would pile on top of each other and the one on the bottom would try to be a rhinoceros that was hatching out, and the top person in the pile would fall off on the floor with a thump, and then their grumpy father would yell from the bedroom below that to be quiet, we're trying to sleep down here on a Sunday morning. Or how in their family they didn't go to church, but they walked in outside of Zurich in the hills, and admired what the Great Spirit had created there in the Swiss mountains. So there was this sense of a connection to her own childhood that was kind of enchanting to me. And she read a lot of stories to me. I remember she read me a story about Johann Sebastian Bach and his childhood, and she read me a book of the history of the world by Henry van Loon, and I think she read me the Jungle books and things in the Dr. Dolittle books, which was a whole series about the doctor who spoke to the animals. And she played me folk songs from Carl Sandburg's song bag, with songs like Turkey in the Straw and a hayseed. One day to himself he did say, I've got just an hour and a minute, so his money he drew, into the country he flew, that hayseed was bound to be in it. And on Sunday mornings was the time that my mother would have to herself, and for a few hours she would play Schubert and Schumann and Brahms and Bach, and I would sit under the piano and read the funny papers while this sophisticated music was being played. Or she would play 78 RPM records of Paul Robeson singing the Ballad of Americans and other left-wing songs, as well as Beethoven quartets and things like that. So her sense of what was fair and social justice, they were big enthusiasts of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal, and her general kindness to people, that in those days she would get things from the Fuller Brushman, Mr. Bernstein, who would come every month or so and knock on the door and sell brushes and cleaning soaps and things like that. And Mr. Bernstein was always treated with the greatest respect, and I think offered a cup of coffee, Nescafe and cookies and things like that. So there was this modeling of generosity and fairness to people of all social classes that I picked up from her in a way that my father would have approved of, but I didn't see him do that because he was more involved in his work.
So we were talking earlier about how Grandma Dione was a partner in RJN's endeavors in a way, and how that her influence on him was more than an influence. It was actually, she had a very critical role in making sure that all the social things were taken care of while he was taking care of the architectural and technical and maybe logistical things.
So her relationship to my dad starts when she's 19 and he is 9 years older, so he's 28. He's just spent 4 years as an artillery officer, horse-drawn artillery, riding through Montenegro to Albania and so forth.
Did he see any action in the war?
I think that he got shelled and did some shelling, but it wasn't like the kind of action that the people on the Western Front in that trench warfare had. there's a fellow from Santa Barbara who went through my dad's German diaries and has traced where he went.
Do you remember his name?
I'm blocking on it now. He's a art history professor at Santa Barbara, and comments that that's a chapter of the war that was very well documented by the Austrian army after the fact, but is sort of not so well known as the ones that, particularly in the United States, where we were on the Western Front. But so as a young girl, she falls in love with this demobilized Austrian lieutenant. But pretty early on, she gets fascinated with his career. And her mother also is fascinated and very fond of my father. And there's these funny statements by my mother that, my father could have fallen in love with her mother instead of her, because my grandmother probably was 10 or 15 years older than my father. She would have been in her late 40s when my father was in his nearly 30. So my father's own family was not so involved with his career as my mother's family was. They were quite a bit older than my dad and more conservative, not particularly interested in modernist things. And so he found a new home in that family. But fairly early on, my mother is, in her letters, is talking about how she wants to support his mission and his career and his idea of a new kind of architecture. And yet at the same time, she wants to pursue, mostly at that point, it was her career as a cellist, and she took lessons in Berlin with a fairly famous teacher named Hugo Becker. But by the time that she's getting married, he, as a wedding present, buys her a typewriter, and her present to him is learning how to type. And some early letters talks about how yes, they'll have children together, but her main commitment is to him, because the children will grow up and leave and they will be left together, and this is what her role is. And she writes to his sister that to her pride, Richard considers her as his advisor, this much younger woman. And I think probably from the beginning, she's advising him on human relations in a way, and comforting him not to get so discouraged. And so early in the relationship, they have Frank, and then Richard gets this opportunity to go to the United States, and they decide that she would stay back until Frank is born with her parents, while he goes and tries to find a job in the United States. And then in 1924, she and Frank are going to come to the United States, and they arrive in Bremen to get on the boat. And my mother naively doesn't realize that my brother needs to have his own visa to come. Mm-hmm. And she's not allowed to take the baby on the boat, so she makes this decision and that she will go and ask her mother whether the mother will take the child.
And how old was Frank at that point?
Frank is just a few months old.
Wow.
And but mother had gotten a breast infection and been in the hospital for a month or so before that anyway, so the grandmother had been taking care of the child. And so grandmother agrees, and that Mütterli, grandmother Niederman agrees. So that's also part of the commitment to help this young man and her son-in-law to have his wife come and be with him. And mother arrives at Ellis Island and then is taken straight away to Taliesin East for a visit that she writes about in great detail. And then they go back to Highland Park while RJN is continuing to work with Hollibird and Roach, this big architectural firm, until Wright, a month or so later, says, okay, you can come and work with me and I'll pay you $40 a month, $40 a week, I think it was. Mm-hmm. And so they're there for about 4 months, and during that time, grandmother brings Frank to Taliesin with the help of Frank Lloyd Wright, sort of through some senator that he knows, helping that happen. Mm. And then they come to Los Angeles. So there's this period then where she is a young mother with little kids, trying to also be a singer, but she's also there very interested in what my father is doing. And pretty soon, at my grandmother's urging, my father enters the competition for the League of Nations design, and he gets the reluctant Schindler to finally get involved with it. And at one point, my mother comments that that she has learned to just prepare extra food for their dinner, because Schindler often drops in just at dinner time, and she loves to see the two of them talking, and they have so much fun together and so forth. But interestingly, it's Schindler not with his wife, who's off doing something else. And later they're talking about the League of Nations, and Pauline Schindler comments that she's completely out of the loop on this project, and mother's feeling sort of sorry for her because she knows exactly what Richard is talking about. So she is an enthusiastic audience to hear what he has to say. Mm-hmm. And in an environment where there are very few people who are enthusiastic about this kind of modern architecture. And it's at that point that they kind of work out that she's not going to be able to be a mother and sing in choruses or have concerts, but more sing in choruses or be in chamber music groups or things like that, and also be available to him. And she makes a decision that she'll continue taking singing lessons and continue taking cello lessons, but it will be more as a single performer. And at a certain point, when he's giving a lecture, he invites her to come along, and she plays a few pieces of music for the same audience. And they negotiate that on Sunday mornings, that's the time when he's not supposed to bother her, and that she gets to sing, and then that's her Sunday morning activity. And
so how much of that is conjecture in terms of like how RJN included Grandma Dione in his lectures? Because what was the fork in the road for that conversation? Because was she trying to be a professional musician?
Yes, there was a period there, and she talks about that in her oral history at UCLA, and also it shows up in some of their letters where there's this negotiation about how to make this work, how to keep her music going, and at the same time have this commitment to him, and at the same time trying to manage the children with the complication that their oldest child turns out to be autistic and throw tantrums when they make a left turn in the road, or when the phone rings more than 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
And so she goes through this, weathers this period up until the late 30s, where RJN starts to have a lot of work. And he gets appendicitis, and afterwards he falls down the stairs and breaks an arm.
How does he fall down the stairs?
I think it's after the operation, and he was lightheaded and fell down the stairs. And their relationship hits a rocky period at that point. And my dad suggests that they should try to once more to have a girl. And she thinks that kind of doesn't make a lot of sense, but the other boys are in their early teens now, and I think he senses that she needs to have a little girl as a companion. And so they try, and indeed she gets pregnant in 1939. I'm born, and I'm a little boy.
Shame on you.
And but that was kind of the role that I played in the family, as sort of her companion. And by nature, I'm a much more amenable person than Dione, and certainly easier than Frank was. And so, but by the time I get to be maybe 3rd or 4th grade, now I'm not so easy to deal with, and she's discovering that she can't really be as much of a mother to me and also be involved with my dad, who by that time his career is really taking off. And so
that's like early 40s.
Well, it's really the mid to late 40s by the time that happens. And she sends me to summer school, and I really am flourishing there, because now, instead of being sort of a peripheral fly on the wall in this very active household with my older brother, autistic brother, throwing tantrums, and Dione by that time was pretty much out of the picture. He was in Switzerland.
What was he doing?
He was studying in architecture in Switzerland. So she copes with it by arranging for me to go to boarding school. And I look back at that time as being a happy time. It was much more structured, and I was able to be kind of successful with guidance and stuff like that. So from then on, in the late 40s, she's really mostly focusing as my father's executive director. And that it can be quite stressful when they're in Silver Lake, but then they often travel together, and that's a time when a lot of external input is lowered, and they're meeting interesting people, and they're traveling places, and um, this is a happy time for them. Um, but I came across some correspondence about the time that in the early 40s when they were going to this assignment in Puerto Rico. And there came a time when they were trying to sort out whether or not they were going to be going there, and there were all kinds of papers that they had to get from the government to travel during wartime. And my dad gets pneumonia. This is a time before antibiotics. And so my mother writes back to describe how she was the one who went around to the State Department and to various places and got the paperwork done and arranged for my dad to be put on the train to go to New York to a hospital. And it's clear that she relishes all this stuff that she's doing as his partner to make things happen. And then at the towards the end of that period, she's arranging for travel to go across the country, and she gets this idea of, if they're going through Chicago, why shouldn't she and little Raymond go up to Taliesin 20 years after they were first there? And she writes Frank Lloyd Wright about that. He says, yes, come and stay a week and it'll be great. And then later it turns out that my dad can go too, so they all go up and have this visit. And this kind of resourcefulness that she kind of picked up from my dad, of saying, well, if we're going here, then we might as well go there. And then there's also the willingness and flexibility to change. And I've told you the story before about our visit in, or rather our vacation to go up the North Coast, and we go to a particular place north of Eureka that my dad is intrigued by, and then he goes into the store and comes out and goes into the phone booth, and then comes out and says, yeah, Dione, where do you think we're going to spend tonight? And she gets a smile on her face because she knows an adventure is about to happen, and says, yeah, where are we going to go? And he said, we are going to Lake Tahoe, to the such and such hotel. And why are we going to such and such a hotel? Because the Ford dealers are meeting there. And why do we care about the Ford dealers? Because the man who owns that piece of property is Mr. Smith, who's from the local Ford dealership, and he's there for that thing. And so we pick up and drive over the Trinity Alps into the Central Valley and up to Lake Tahoe and check in, and he leaves a note for the guy saying that he would like to invite him for breakfast, and shows him his Time magazine laminated card with and explains who he is, and tries to get a deal to build something there. So the fact that my mother is up for a complete 180-degree change of agenda was very characteristic of their relationship, because she that was fun for her, right? And some wives would be, upset, but we were going to go and do this, right?
So was it just the three of you on that trip?
It was just the three of us.
And so you remember that conversation and sort of the twinkle in his eye and the whole...
Right.
And what were there other examples like that? So obviously you didn't get the deal with this guy.
Right.
But you ended up having a good time up in Tahoe, and
right,
doing whatever one does in Tahoe when your deal doesn't work out.
Right.
But do you remember other instances like that where RJN kind of threw a wrench in the works, or made a 180 turn, and your mom kind of chuckled and went along with it?
I'm trying to think of whether I was present on some of these other ones. I remember there was another episode where he was lecturing in Dubrovnik and got the idea that there was supposed to be a big dinner, and he got the idea that he wanted to go up into the mountains to see the place where he had served in the army, and he went up there and then came back and was late, and they missed the talk, and she wasn't so happy about that. She thought, that he had a commitment to talk to these people, and it wasn't nice, but that was also characteristic of him. She was there as a sympathetic ear for him. She was the person who did the publicity and kept the friendly relationship with the editors of the Architectural Record and the Architectural Forum and Architecture Aujourd'hui and the equivalents in Italy and Germany and in Brazil and Argentina.
Did she keep them all frothed up in the right way so that like what a PR firm would do today?
She would, they would visit these people when they were in those countries and establish a relationship. And then she was the one that kept up the correspondence. And apparently he was kind of unique among the architects in that he would have the texts and everything all set up for the article about whatever piece of project that they were shipping around. And my father knew to always send the things first to Europe, because he knew that the New York magazines would see those and say, well, we would like to publish it here too. Then the people in Brazil would be interested, so that, or sometimes things would be simultaneously sent to these peripheral things. And scholars who have looked at this notice that in the Mexican magazines, my father is much more, keeps showing up much more frequently than Le Corbusier or Mies or Frank Lloyd Wright.
Was that deliberate, you think?
Yeah.
Do you think that was RJN's doing or Dionne's doing?
No, it would be, he would do it, but then she would know that he would want to do it and would say, well, how about, should we send this over to so-and-so?
Right, so she would make sure that the peanut butter was spread the right way.
Right.
Yeah.
And the other thing that happened was that when they went places, she would keep track of all the people that hosted them and maintain relationships with them. And so she had started writing a yearly letter describing what they had done, and all these people would get copies of that yearly letter, and she would, and many of them would write back. So when they went to those countries again, they had that linkage with people, and then of course the other thing that she did was to be a hostess, and we found this diary that she kept of everybody who came to dinner from 1939 to 1963, and she would keep track of what she sang to them, because usually there would be some singing, and what she served to them, and sometimes she would comment on what she thought about the people. It seemed like most of these people came only once. There are a few people that keep showing up that are friends of the family that get invited along, but there would be some distinguished person from out of town, and then they would invite somebody that they had met here or there to come, and people were sort of intrigued by coming to this modern house. But it was clearly an exercise in networking and hoping that through this network jobs would show up.
And did they?
I'm not sure how many were due to that effort. My dad also made sure that he was published in more popular things like the Los Angeles Times Sunday Supplement or Sunset Magazine, or things like that, and then he would lecture a lot so that people would hear about him. And I think that that may have been a more successful had a better batting average.
Right, because I remember, what was his name? The musician who went to one of his lectures, and then he went up to him after the lecture and said, "Hey, will you design a house for me?" And I'm trying to remember his name.
Yeah, John Clark.
John Clark, right? Right, and his wife.
Yeah. And then, of course, he published a lot of. There were books about him, and then he published his own picture books, and then he wrote Survival Through Design, and at least one person, Corwin Hanch, who was a professor of chemistry at Pomona College, said that he read Survival Through Design, and on the basis of that he was intrigued and commissioned my dad to design this house where he lived until his 90s.
Where was that house?
In Claremont. It's a really nice house. So there was this support that she gave, an understanding of what he was about, and a commitment to further his career in these practical ways, but also in this emotional way. And when he died, she breathed a sigh of relief, because in the last years of his life, so now he died at the same age that I am now, 78 years old. And in the last maybe 6 or 7 years of his life, he just couldn't, what he had hoped for was that somehow he could continue being a designer without the hassle or the financial risks of running an office. And he ultimately handed it over to Dione, but Dione wanted to be the designer of in the office, and he wanted my father to play the role of just bringing the jobs in for him to do. And that was frustrating for my father, and he was also going out of style in the United States. Postmodernism was coming in, and he could not adapt himself to anything but this role of a mover and shaker and somebody that was going to do something. And he tried to start this Neutra Institute, and there were some flaky people that were attracted to it, but it wasn't a very realistic plan that he had for it. So nothing was quite working out for him the way he wanted to do, other than he was invited to give lectures mostly in Europe. And my mother kept trying to figure out some way to set things up for him that would make him happy, and there was nothing that really worked out. So he did not have the ability to sit back and adjust his life so that it fit what the external realities were.
Mm.
And when he died, my reaction was, thank God he's finally released from this impossible situation, and Mother is released from trying to make it right for him.
That's interesting.
And
so what was your interpretation of his dilemma? I mean, I know that your mom's interpretation of it was probably very specific, but when you were talking to Mom about,
well, I would talk to him too, and he would sort of argue about how he was going to try and do this, and it was such a waste that he'd accumulated all this fame that he couldn't use it for the greater good, and that was my interpretation, that there was no way that was really going to happen. It wasn't working out.
And would you say things to him? Like, what would you say to him, and what would his response be?
There's a particular taped conversation that where this is going on, where he's talking about it, and I'm saying, this isn't realistic, and he didn't want to hear it. And it would have required a kind of personal resilience that he didn't have, that he was stuck in a particular role, and it was only in that role that he could be happy, despite the fact that he had all kinds of skills and resources that would have allowed him to become less of a public person.
Mm-hmm.
And smell the roses.
So he wasn't, his personality wasn't really geared towards enjoying his success. He really was trying to stretch for something else that was maybe a little out of his reach.
Yeah, well, he wanted to continue to be influential, and be influential as the famous architect.
Right, but with postmodernism,
it wasn't, it wasn't happening. And so she did her best to help him with that, but you could see that it was tough. And when he died, characteristically, she sat down and sort of reassessed, well, what am I going to do now? I've spent my life helping this guy reach, and I would say, our goals. It wouldn't be his goals, it was our goals. And now I'm on my own, and what am I going to do? And she sent out a letter to her friends, saying that, she was going to go back and start doing her music and so forth. And then she discovered this box in the basement saying, "To read when I get old," which happened to be all these letters between them. And she quickly...
Did she put the box there?
She had put that there sometime before.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to figure out what that box was, because it has letters to my grandparents. And either they always made carbon copies and kept it for themselves, or because some of them are handwritten. I think that my grandmother, who had a sense of the historic nature of this guy that was her son-in-law, kept, and then maybe upon her death, which happened in the early 60s, Regula found these and gave them to my mother.
Because Mujerli was living in Kelton, right?
Kelton, right.
So she was just across town.
She was just across town, and Regula might have found those letters and say, "Oh, look at all this," and then Mother put it into a box.
Right.
And it would have been somehow that it had survived the fire. Maybe it was in the basement of the house or something like
or it was
that.
in Kelton.
or some of it could have been in Kelton. But whatever it was, she rediscovered it in 1970. And so then she just set about translating all these letters and typing them up and coming up with an organization and finding a publisher for them, Southern Illinois University Press, and got it published. And this was all happening just around the time that Tom Hines was writing his book. So she was able to share a lot of that with Tom Hines. And then she set about getting a manuscript that RJN had never published, Neutra Neutra, finding a publisher and an editor for that, who was a fellow who had been an editor for the Saturday Review. And once again, it was, the network that she had maintained that allowed her to pull all of that together. Now, on the other side, something happened to her personality at that point, that she became, well, while she was with my dad, she was kind of very natural and retiring. And then after he died, she took on some of his characteristics of being a little bit more structured and a little bit not so genuine, I would say. It was kind of interesting to me that it was as if, as a dyad, she allowed him to be the person who was out there and had a persona, and she could just be this kind of natural person. But then when he was gone, she kept it up, and then she started giving lectures and things like that, which she practiced for, and you saw that lecture that she gave at SciArc, which would be an example of it. Yeah. And then when she was 85, she had this operation that led to a collapse of her adrenal gland, and then she developed some kind of autoimmune reaction to whatever it was that was put in her hip. And she became increasingly frail. And then something which I found very admirable happened, that she just kept adapting to the greater restrictions without becoming depressed, but just kept focusing on the things that were left to her that she enjoyed. And earlier today I told you about that episode when she had to have her leg amputated, and she told me as she went into the operation that she expected that it wouldn't be such a bad thing if she died during the operation. And then when I came back after the operation and expected to find her all confused and post-operative, she was sitting up happily in bed reading a newspaper, and that she, as I came in the room, she gave me this beatific smile and said that she was glad that she had survived because she just loved reading the Christian Science Monitor. And during that last year after that operation, she was able to get that book published,
Neutra Neutra.
Neutra Neutra. And then in the summer of 1990, I came for a visit, and she said, now I'm starting to have trouble reading and I'm ready to go. And a month later, she had some kind of dental procedure and came home and went to sleep. And when Delcy, the nurse, came in the morning, she was comatose and then died. She must have had a stroke in the night. And she continued to, in that period of time, to entertain people. I had this funny experience in Vienna where I gave a talk and talked about the people that knocked on the door, and this quite Theodore, what's his name? He's a Greek architect who told the story that he had come to Los Angeles as a student of the architect Paul Rudolph, who suggested that when he came west that he should look up Neutra, and he called up, and my dad invited him for dinner, and this guy had been the art director for the famous movie Never on Sunday with Melina Mercouri. And so my dad pulled out some sketches that he had recently done in Greece, and they had a nice time, and that was sometime in the mid-50s. And then he became a professor at Harvard and quite distinguished, and was in Los Angeles in the late 80s, and heard that the building that he had visited had partially burned down and been rebuilt. So he and his wife came to photograph the house, and a nurse came out, that would have been Delcy, and said, "Can I help you?" And he explained who he was and that he had been visiting, and Delcy said, "Well, wait a second," and came back out and said, "Mrs. Neutra remembers you and would love to see you, but she needs to get ready. She's been ill. Could you come back in an hour?" And so they came back, and my mother was there in her wheelchair, all dolled up, and offered them tea and cookies, and they had a nice time. And he took a picture, or had Delcy take a picture with them and him that he gave me. So, and earlier she hosted Maria Nordman, who became a very famous artist, and she hosted Susan and Titus Labor, who did this movie, and various people came and visited that she opened the house to, so that there are many people that have, fond memories of her and her house concerts that she had at the house, which she continued, from my point of view, beyond the point that she really should have, to the point it was a little painful. She was singing a little out of tune, and she didn't have, that was part of the need for being at the center of attention that she developed towards the end of her life, that was not so skillful from my point of view. And I think that as the oldest daughter of these four, and by and large the best looking of them, that she was kind of the apple of her mother's eye. And she was somebody that liked to please people as well as being spontaneously generous. And sort of towards that period after my father died, there was some aspect of wanting to create for herself the being a focus of attention, that while my father was alive, that it was enough that he was getting attention, and it was enough that he was inviting her to give her concert for a few songs before his lecture. And then after he died, she needed to make it happen. And I felt a little discomfort in that phase of her life, within the context that she was making a life for herself. And I asked her at one point whether she ever was tempted to get married again. She said, "Absolutely not. I'm having a wonderful time of my own." And she was very structured in her, a little bit like Uncle Dion. She had a schedule, and she was quite she went from being a rather chaotic, carefree kind of person as when she first married my dad. People had commented that things were sort of disorganized and she was lying on the couch reading a detective novel, to being very organized. And so the first thing in the morning she would get up and do stretches and exercises and deep knee bends, and then she would go and have a cup of coffee and breakfast, and then she would sing for a certain amount of time, and then she would read the newspaper at a certain point of time, and she had a whole structure that she made for herself on her own that allowed her to continue to be very productive. And she wrote lots of letters and so forth.
And was RJN the one who sort of ushered her into this mindset of organization, or do you think that she sort of did it herself? And
I think that she figured out that if she was going to make this work, that she would have to get organized. And he had his own schedule that he got up and early in the morning and either wrote or went through all the drawings and sent them down to the office. And so that there was a rhythm to his thing, and for her to fit in with his schedule, she had to have her schedule.
And do you think that, so as a kid, was she already organized when you were, you know?
By the time I came around, she was quite organized, yeah. And what's amazing is that she found time to write a diary intermittently. And she wrote a diary about me, and I have this book where she, throughout my childhood, she's saved all this stuff about me. And
it's the one that you thought you had lost?
The one that I lost, and now I found it was starting to fall apart, and so I got one of these portfolio binders and put all the pages in a big plastic thing, so it's now well organized. Well, we got to go because it's 20 of 6.
Okay, yeah, the reservation is at 6:30 now.
Oh, it's at 6:30? Oh, okay.
So, it's funny how, you know, through the lens of history, you can look back and say, oh, you know, RJN was this successful architect, and, you know, of course, by all measures, he was. And it's funny, when I talk to people who recognize my name and say, oh, you know, is that your grandfather? And they're kind of blown away. And they'll say things like, oh, he is the architect for, you know, this era in architecture. But and when I hear that, you know, I know all this history, and, you know, I've heard these stories from you, and so, you know, I just politely nod and say, oh, thank you, that's great, you know, it's kind of a neat history, family history to have. But in my mind, I'm thinking about, you know, the struggle that I know that RJN had, and how he was very much unsure of himself in a lot of ways, and that's maybe in some ways what drove him so hard. And then, of course, I also know the history of how towards the end of his career, that style of architecture was falling out of favor. And even during the 80s, you know, after he had passed away, it wasn't something that was as special, like that style of architecture. But somewhere in like the early 90s, all of a sudden it became really popular again. And now it seems to be sort of at the height of its popularity, that style of architecture and that style of thinking.
Well, you know, when we say it's popular in people that like special architecture. Right. But you were at Chad Overway's house in San Francisco, the 2-3-story thing in the Marina District. Yeah. And Chad tried to sell the house at the same time there was a Hansel and Gretel house across the street. And there were 400 people that came to see the house, and no one made a bid. And meanwhile, the Hansel and Gretel house across the street sold within a week. Wow. And so, yes, it's fashionable to like this thing, but the market is that this is still an acquired taste.
Right.
But it's acquired taste in residences, but not so much in schools. Schools continue to be influenced by those modern schools.
Right.
And apartments, modern apartments are still something that are accepted. So it's something of a mystery what it means to say that he was so influential. And I think what it means is that the kind of architecture that he did was something that it was easy to imitate and adapt. And so towards the end of his career, there were a lot of people that were doing architecture that was as good as what he was doing or even better. And so he didn't stand out as unusual. Well, Frank Lloyd Wright, everything he did was always different from what he had done before and what anybody else was doing. And it wasn't so easy to imitate Frank Lloyd Wright. You couldn't kind of do it as well as Frank Lloyd Wright did it. And the same, well, Mies was pretty easy to imitate, but it also was a solution for commercial architecture that worked pretty well. And somehow people recognized that Mies was the one who did it first. And Le Corbusier was always Le Corbusier and not so easy to imitate. So in some ways, my dad was aiming towards a kind of vernacular architecture, and he was so successful that he no longer stood out, and he wasn't intending to stand out, really. Although he would have liked to have had all this attention, but he was philosophically committed to keep refining what he was doing.
So that was sort of, in some ways, the downfall of his popularity, but the legacy that makes him stand out over time.
Right, because he was productive and active for a 40-year period, and there are a bunch of people who were also doing things interesting in the 1920s that sort of disappear from sight, that didn't continue and also didn't evolve and didn't perfect. So now there is this resurgence of interest in neuroscience and aesthetics, and people are paying attention to just the thing that he was quite excited about towards the last half of his career, and recognizing that he was an interesting thinker around that area. And we had this discussion in Porto about what does it mean for him to have been a person of interest, because in medicine, the people who were the first people to do a resection of the stomach, but you wouldn't want to do that operation in exactly the same way now that you did then. That you expect that people move on from that, but you respect the fact that they started something in a particular direction. And I think that that's the kind of thing that Dione and I are trying to clarify in the goals for the Neutra Institute. Is he very generously is proposing to leave quite a legacy to that. And it really is to say, how do you advance that particular kind of architecture that's more focused on the client than it is on building an iconic building. And
so yeah, that's maybe a good place to take the end of this conversation, which is where does that refinement go in the future? So you have 40 years of progress made by one individual and people also working in that same style. But what is the next step to that legacy of biorealism, or designing for humans, or designing for a client specifically, and not designing for a marketing, designing to some marketing goal, or designing to some other goal?
Yeah, what I realized in when I was in Porto, we went to see Rem Koolhaas's Casa de Musica, which is this tour de force, a really interesting building. Mm-hmm. And realizing that we pay most attention to these iconic buildings that, and people, of course, either the public entity that wants to do it wants to make a statement, and you just can't get away from the fact that this is really important, that the Sydney Opera House, which is probably acoustically not so hot and is not the most easy place to stage an opera, is nonetheless put Sydney on the map. Mm-hmm. And that it serves a particular function, and there's a need for those kinds of architects. Mm-hmm. But that was by and large not what my dad was trying to do.
If you had to sort of encapsulate what he was trying to do, how would you describe it, and who was he doing it for?
So he tended to be interested in a whole type of building that didn't lend itself to be so iconic, and that's small houses, public apartment houses, schools, libraries, hospitals, medical clinics, what he called architecture of social concern, where we spend, in office buildings, places where people spend most of their time, and where you needed to be successful, you needed to think about what people were doing, how people were socializing, what people were experiencing, and then how people were affected without even being conscious of it. And so that kind of thing is a little bit more boring. But there are innovations in that, and there are people that are paying attention to what works and what doesn't work. And so I think one of the goals, the forward-looking goals, is to try to figure some way to support and celebrate the people that do a good job in that way and that are moving things along. And now we have all kinds of new challenges because of climate change and new materials and so forth, where there's things to celebrate in there, even though they're not iconic buildings. And then there's the other piece, which is people that are figuring out ways to pay attention to the biological demands of design. And that's not only architecture, but it could even be software or products or even artificial intelligence capabilities that are either supportive or clash with our biological needs. And so those are the forward-looking goals that we've agreed on for the Neutra Institute, and then the backward ones is just supporting the legacy with innovative ways to look at what was done and then try to say, well, what does this suggest for the future? Well, why wouldn't this work now? It worked then, but what is it about now that wouldn't work? And what are some questions that were asked that are relevant for the future?
All right, so that's probably a good place to stop, because we can go get some Chinese food and stuff.
Okay. Thank you.
No, thank you, Dad.